Welcome back to the Drummer Mindset Podcast. I'm Joel Pereira. Today I'm releasing my episode with Adam Chase. Adam Chase has been playing music all his life. He and his brother headed up the band Black Eyed Susan. By the time he was 20 years old, he had shared stages with Aerosmith, Santana, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Wyclef Jean, and many others. He also started the project Jazz is Phish, an instrumental tribute to Phish. He'd also started the James Brown Dance Party and the Dab Sessions. Through these kinds of projects, he's been able to play with folks like John Medeski, Mono Neon, shared the stage, and played with Clyde Stubblefield, Dennis Chambers, George Porter Jr., Domi, JD Beck, Adam Deitch. It's when you look at the list, it's almost ridiculous. And I think it's really a testament to what you'll find out in this episode, that he really knows how to cultivate relationships. And a big part of that is because you can tell he cares. And it's not just about him, and it's not just about whatever project he's doing, but it's really, really cool to see the ways that he supports other people in his music and in his collaborations. He shares a lot of wisdom in this conversation, so I was really grateful to have him. Without further ado, here's me and Adam Chase. Jazz is Phish, is that something that you helped to start?
Yeah. I conceived the idea, and it's my band technically. Even though it's a collective, I'm the music director. I'm the one who puts it all together. Mm-hmm. Initially, my brother was very involved. It was still kind of came out of my brain, but it was like a Chase Brothers production type of thing, and he was the main guitarist. And for years, he and I were on every gig, and then different people would, kind of circle around us. And then when he had his children, I started needing to get subs for him. So then people like Mike Seal and Lee Barber and Bob Lanzetti and, different guitarists started coming in. And so it kind of shifted more onto my plate, as far as I'm pretty much at this point the only person who's on every gig.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did you step into that music director role? Was this the first time you had done that kind of thing?
Yeah, actually. So growing up, my brother was considered a child prodigy on guitar. So when he was, 10 years old, he was doing, pretty big performances. And by the time he was, 13, 14, he was opening for Derek Trucks and Victor Wooten, and then OAR and Olu Dara. And
where'd y'all grow up?
In Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
So people really circled around my brother. He's definitely I think, I play with who I consider the best musicians in the world, and he's up there. I think he's, you could put him up in a conversation with people like John McLaughlin and Pat Metheny, and his knowledge of music is next level. His, technical abilities on the guitar are do at the level he's at. It's just a matter of taste. Do you like him, or do you like Pat, or do you like, who do you, Schofield, but he, there's no walls for him, musically. I mean, not to say that in absolute terms, because there's always growth in music. That's part of, but there is a point you get to in music where it becomes more of a spiritual endeavor. You get a lot of the technique down, you get the understanding of theory down, and then it just becomes a matter of what do you have to do to express yourself and, kind of grow as a human.
Do you remember for you when that happened?
Oh, I haven't hit that point. Okay. I give my brother credit for that. I think that I'm actualized for myself. I know how to express myself on my instrument, which is the drums. I don't believe that I'm anywhere close to perfecting my technique. I think that for me, music has been a spiritual quest more than anything, and so where I know a lot of drummers that put all of their time into practicing technique and chops and different drumming patterns. For me, drumming has been more of a shamanistic way to kind of alter my consciousness, and it's been a practice in meditation, and a practice in awareness, and be here now kind of mentality. And that's my practice in music is very much both when I'm playing individually and then with other people. My ultimate goal is not to impress people or to necessarily master the instrument, but to collectively bring kind of everyone together in a place where we are here now, where listening is like more important than anything. And being in the moment with so that's why I do a lot of improv based music, because that expression is best suited for, I think, improvisation. And not to say that I haven't, I've been studying music for a very long time and studying the drums, and even though I started at 9 years old, maybe. So I've been, I did concert bands and jazz bands and marching bands, and then I, studied drums. I studied with an ethnomusicologist at University of Colorado. Studied Ghanese music, and then at University of Maryland, I studied jazz for a year, and then at that point I was 19, and my brother's drummer was leaving his band, and he asked me to join. And at that point, we were getting opportunities to open for Santana and Aerosmith and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Kiss and all these big bands. So I dropped out of college because the opportunities were there, and I figured, I can always go back to college, but if I pass up these opportunities, they might not be there later, which has proven to be the case. Yeah. A lot of those biggest opportunities did happen in a small window.
Yeah, especially with some of those kind of legends or the legacy bands and stuff. You gotta get in when you can.
Yeah.
What better education?
Yeah, exactly. And, part of me does wish I would have followed through. I was learning a lot when I started studying jazz at Maryland. Technically UMBC, it's at University of Maryland. But yeah, studying music and studying drums was definitely something that I cut short in a formal setting, which, there's pros and cons. Like, the music I was playing at the time was like an indie rock kind of thing, where I didn't need all the chops, didn't need all the knowledge to play it, and my hero in drumming at that time was Ringo Starr. Still is my hero. I think he's a massively underrated drummer.
Agreed.
A lot of people throw shade at him.
They really do.
It blows my mind. Some of his beats to me were like early hip hop beats. Like he had like a feel that on the backbeat of a lot of songs that was like, it sat back further than a lot of music at the time.
Everything he composed was so unique.
Yeah.
Each song is different, and it has that signature on it. And he was always so good in the mix. It seems to me, like the recordings I've heard. From what I understand, it's him that we have to thank, like, speaking of the mix, like just having stage monitors at all, right?
Yeah.
And then also it's so unique too, because I think about a lot of the drummers that I love and I respect the most, and that just impressed me initially. And then what I've just learned recently is that so many of them are like left-handed people that play on a right-handed kit.
Yep. And I actually saw a video recently where Ringo was talking about how some of his phrasings that people love was just a product of him trying to get around the kit as a left-handed player on a right-handed kit. Right. That it was like uncomfortable for him. So sometimes where he would do a phrasing and leave like a rest, and people are like, "Oh man, that rest is so genius." He's like, "Well, I had to. It was the only way I can get set for the next beat."
Absolutely, I see it. It breathes more though.
It does,
for that.
Yeah.
And it gives the band that signature. And I mean, you can't have a band like the Beatles with a crappy drummer. That just is an impossibility.
And you also can't have a band like the Beatles with a fusion drummer. You can't.
Right.
I remember I took lessons from a drummer out of Maryland named John Tamakos, excellent drummer. And when we first started studying, I remember it came up about talking about Charlie Watts. And how he's not the best drummer, and he's really a sloppy drummer in a lot of ways, but that you can't substitute him. There's no other drummer. You change him and you change the sound of the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
That it sometimes technical ability can get in the way of vibe or authenticity. And not to say he's a bad drummer. I think he's also underrated in some respects.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is really just playing the part that's necessary. And I went through a phase actually where I think people underestimated my drumming when I was in like my mid-20s. I had this like minimalism kind of thing in life, and it wasn't just music. Like I hung blank canvases on my walls as artwork, and it was just like this sense of space that I was seeking. And so like when I would get together for jam sessions for people, I would literally just like start off by just hitting the snare on 2 and 4 and just would leave everything open, and I wouldn't play anything, and let the group kind of come together and improvise around that, and then slowly add in little things if necessary. And I think people who knew me and knew that I had skill knew what I was doing, but sometimes when I was playing with somebody for the first time and that was all I brought to the table, they would question if I knew how to play the drums. But it was a very intentional. It was just, I also play keys and I write music. And when I'm writing music and when I'm playing keys, like all I need is like just like a snap or like a 2 and 4 or even a metronome. Like I don't think, as much as drums are my instrument of choice and my love, musically speaking, they are not always necessary. They're not always even when they're necessary, it doesn't always have to be a production on the drums for it to be appropriate or to best serve the music.
Yeah, and I think I see that, like, and I hear that in the music that I've listened from you and some of the live recordings and stuff. It's just, it feels good, and the mix is so good. You were kind of underrated. Did you have that sense while it was happening, or did that realization come later for you?
I had that sense while it was happening with certain people, like my brother who I grew up with, where I went through all my chops phases, and I was, I got introduced to the drums in Baltimore where I grew up. Dennis Chambers' wife was a secretary of an elementary school, and he was teaching Tony Royster Jr.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Tony was studying with Dennis in Baltimore, and I was in the first grade, and I had never seen live drums. I grew up in a Jewish community where, like, when our worship music was like a cello and a choir. There wasn't live drums. Which, my friends who grew up in churches with like, rock and drummers, I felt like had an edge.
Right.
So I just wasn't exposed to it. My family was, steeped in classical music. We all started on piano when we were 5 years old. I had classically trained vocalists in my family and canners, and I didn't learn until later that I had a cousin who was the drummer for Nat King Cole on a couple records and played for Lionel Hampton, and that knowledge came to me later after I started playing the drums. That everyone was like, "Oh, you have a cousin who's a professional drummer," but growing up, I didn't know him, so I just wasn't exposed to it. So the first time I got exposed to live drums, Dennis Chambers brings Tony Royster Jr. into my elementary school for a performance, and I don't know.
And he's
why.
just a prodigy at this point.
He's like my age, a couple years older than me, I think. So I'm, at first grade is what, like 6. Yeah. So I'm like 6 years old. I think Tony was like 8 or 9.
Okay.
And Dennis brings him in. I go in and I watch Tony just destroy a drum set at like 6 years old, and I was obsessed. I started drawing pictures of drums, and that was like an obsession. Even though it took 3 more years before I had the opportunity to play them. When in 4th grade at my elementary school, you were able to pick your instrument. So my early obsessions were Dennis Chambers and Tony Royster Jr., which I'm still, I don't think I'm even now as good as the 9-year-old Tony. He was so ridiculous. But I definitely went through phases where all I practiced was chops, and my brother and I were sharing the same household, so he was aware of my skills, which is why he asked me to join his band when his drummer left. And we obviously, as brothers, had a really good chemistry. But yeah, it was later in life that I started, kind of going through that minimalist phase. So yeah, some of the people that didn't know me at all, if their only exposure to me was this guy just kind of clapping on 2 and 4 to create a backdrop for them to improvise. They didn't necessarily know that I had like a whole, bag of tricks, so to say, or chops, because I didn't dig into it, and I thought it was unnecessary to do so.
Yeah.
But it never really stopped me from being able to work with the musicians I wanted to work with. Ultimately, I was more interested in songwriting than just writing good music was more important to me than being like a chops guy. And interestingly enough, even now at this stage of my life, often when I'm working with different musicians, and I've been fortunate, I do collaborations with the Snarky Puppy guys, and Felix and Mike Seal and Jeff Coffin and George Porter Jr., Antoine Stan, the people I play with are considered the greats, and I know that I can hang with them. But I always think to myself, and especially with the younger musicians that I work with, I pose the question: if you could do one of two things, if you could either write the best music in the world or you had all the chops in the world, but it had to be one or the other, which would you choose?
Yeah.
And I always feel like that's kind of a revealing question for me anyways, to hear the answer. And that's actually, so Chess Club is one of my new bands. And that was a question I posed to Danny, who is, it's a duo, and he's my songwriting partner in that. And he is top of his class, Berkeley grad.
Does he live here as well? Or?
No, he lives in New York.
Okay.
He lives in New York. He's 23, recently graduated from Berkeley. I got introduced to him. I took Domi on a couple tours with Jazz's Phish, and she's now her band is
how old was she at that point?
I think she was like 17 17, 18 years old maybe. But yeah, her and JD Beck now have their duo and are the face of jazz, the new generation of jazz. At the time I had to convince, it was like an all-star pitch that I had for these bands, and a lot of the venues didn't know who she was, and they were like, oh, we need star power. I'm like, just trust me, please. I can promote it. People will come out, and then you're going to be happy that this girl once played your venue. And so, most people trusted me on that. A couple people didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. I made the shift from wanting it to be about the star power to wanting it to be about the chemistry and the talent. Where that kind of was more important than does the person have a name that can sell tickets. Then I kind of started to resent that as it became a thing where venues are like, oh, who's in the lineup? I'm like, I hate that question. I don't even want to talk about lineups anymore in music. Like, the question should be, is the music good? And because I was noticing fans oh, well, I come see them. Well, who's playing? Who's in the band? And I started almost out of resentment for that whole situation. Just you know what? I'm going to find young killing people who I can introduce to these worlds that I've built. You might not know them, but my fans are gonna have to learn to trust me and my taste in people. But I guess I'm bouncing all around.
It's okay.
Right now.
It's the nature of these conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm following in what so far. What I find interesting is that when you were in your 20s, you knew at the time that people were underestimating what you could do and didn't really see what you were aiming for. And it's likewise reflected again in your promotion work and trying to lift up these other acts that, based on the talent that you've experienced from them and not their name so much. But it sounds like in both instances, you just hold true to that. Or you fight for it anyway.
Yeah, I definitely fight for it. I mean, sometimes it's a challenge because, there's the business side of music where you have to sell tickets and you have to put butts in seats to keep venues. You want to keep the venues happy because they need to make money. If they don't sell tickets and they don't make money, they don't exist, and then there's no place for music to grow. So I'm sensitive to it, but I've always really tried to keep authenticity at the forefront of everything I do. So I learned the hard way in some occasions where I would bring someone on based on their name, and it was never someone who was a slouch. I never hire anybody who I don't love them musically, but sometimes there would be the sense of, oh, I want to work with this person because of who they are. And then a lot of times if that was the onus for the decision, it would backfire. The chemistry wouldn't be right, or there would be an ego that was kind of hard to break down. My goal with music is for every musical experience I have to be a bit egoless. I definitely want to be using that opportunity on stage to find that kind of here and now kind of place where everyone's present with each other. And I think the ultimate experiences, I think the experiences that people walk away and the hair standing up on their arms is when everyone is like here and now together, the audience and the band, is when like there's something transcendent happens. And you don't have to put your finger on it. It doesn't necessarily even mean that it was improvisation that took you there. I think that authenticity and focusing on the talent and the energy of the person, their what they bring to the table, and less about who they are is important for me anyways.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a new challenge as far as like gaining some notoriety or whatever. You think about like a Pat Metheny or someone who like comes by so much talent from a lot of hard work and maybe some natural ability, but really like you can tell, like I think of like Nate Smith too, or just like, any of those guys that we had mentioned, like they had worked to be able to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, and then at some point they gain this name, and then there's this expectation, and it's got to be hard to keep innovating and keep growing at some point, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in the jazz world too, there's that same pressure. You look at, Miles Davis's career, he, as players got more, notoriety, Herbie and Wayne and, different players, that would be like the bands he put together, and they would promote the players that were on the bill. And that's a lot in the jazz world. Even now, like you see, collaborations between different jazz musicians, and it's like, a part of it is like, what, can we package it and sell it? Right. From a promoter standpoint, there's always that kind of promoter mindset that the musicians ideally don't have to buy into too much. You have a manager or an agent or people kind of handling that perspective of it. But there is a lot of pressure, and there always has been, to like, for like a sense of, oh, is it a super group or is it this or that? It's done to death now, but it does go back, for quite a ways as far as collaborations are concerned. But I guess jumping back with Danny with Chess Club, I took him on tour. He was referred through Domi because Domi couldn't do a tour. She referred a couple of her friends, and so in her circle there was this gentleman named young amazing prodigy named Jonathan Huber, and then his best friend is Danny Darris, and I looked into both of them, and they're both just incredible players and seemed like good people. I took Jonathan on a tour to fill in for Domi, and posing the question of what would you rather do, have the chops or the songwriting. And he was like, oh, I would want all the chops. And he puts the time in to get those chops. He's so good. If you don't know him, like his name on like streaming services, Hubie, Hubie. Okay. But Jonathan Huber is his name. Incredible pianist. He does like really cool harmonization videos of like dogs howling. Really cool stuff, and his ears are incredible. His just his voice is like warm, genuine human, and it comes through in his music. But then there was another tour that he and Domi couldn't do, and so the next in line of my referrals from them was Danny Darris. So I reached out to him, and it was funny because when I looked on his, a lot of musicians vet people on their socials, right? If you're going to hire someone, like, oh, let me see if this guy can play. Right. And so I went to Danny's Instagram, and it was him singing all these pop songs that he had wrote, and, beautiful voice, great songs. But, there wasn't like shredding key playing, and for what I was trying to hire him for, I needed like a competent soloist, someone who can read really complex charts, who can do group improvisation. And I wasn't sure. I was a bit nervous. So actually, the first time I had a chance to hire him, I opted for a different player. I hired a gentleman named Charlie Brown, he tours with Mono Neon now as his keyboardist. Okay. He's out of Portland, Oregon. Really amazing player as well. And I took him, and then another tour came back. Charlie couldn't do it. Domi wasn't available. Huber wasn't available. And I mean, I actually went through like a whole Rolodex of people before I called Danny, but then none of my people that I normally would use were available. And so I just like dug further into Danny's Instagram, and I just looked at the top stuff, and I went way back. And when he was in high school, he was doing like crazy Chick Corea stuff and Robert Glasper stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, this guy is killing. So I hired him for the tour. He was incredible. And in that tour, I posed the question, like, if you could write music or have all the chops, which he's like, I would be a songwriter 100%.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, I like that answer. You know,
Yeah.
nobody ever says that, it's very rare.
There's that question came up. I go to a frequent this one jazz club in town, and I was talking to this drummer, Evan Martin, and he kind of posed that question, but a little bit differently. He was like, and his question was like, would you want to play? What's more important, playing musically or like having chops? And I was like, well, musically, but I didn't. That was just kind of what came out. I don't know why I said it. And he was like, yeah, that's what I would say too. And he was like, because if the music calls for chops, you still got that too if you're playing musically,
It's true.
It's kind of a workaround.
Yeah.
But those kind of questions are always interesting,
Yeah, and it's a little bit it's silly of a question because ultimately, really, the answer is both.
Right.
I want to do it all, right?
Right.
But it was interesting. So, with Danny on that tour, I have a really kind of dark humor mindset about a lot of stuff, and I like puns and silly jokes, and just I'm always looking for a joke. I feel like humor is a very high form of spirituality.
Yeah.
And so on that tour, we quickly learned we had the same sense of humor, and we were just cracking each other up. And
because the songs y'all have put together are hilarious.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's just fun to listen to, and it's like juxtaposed with this like really well produced, great mix of sounds, that are just like so clean. And just sound so good, and then it's just like joke after joke,
Yeah, and layers of jokes. Like it's like, wait, what did he just say?
Exactly.
But it was funny because on that tour, like he takes like his songwriting is he's one of the few people I know who genuinely loves listening to like Justin Bieber and 1975 and Olivia Rodrigo, all like the young kind of what some people would consider like cheesy pop music,
right?
But then also Chick Corea and Robert Glasper and Snarky and all those cats. So he's got a very wide palette. He was taking his songwriting very seriously. Like he was putting out serious pop tunes that were in that kind of Justin Bieber 1975 world, but it was like too serious. Like I couldn't authentically play that music and take myself that seriously because I don't really listen. Like I like pop music, but I grew up in the 90s when grunge, I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s with like grunge music, and then like some of the pop music that was kind of coming out towards the tail end of the grunge era when things started kind of cleaning up and becoming more polished pop,
right?
Was like early Maroon 5, early Coldplay,
sure,
stuff like that. And by the time it got into like the NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, and then started building towards this polished pop, I was, it wasn't really for me. I was going to see, jazz like Ahmad Jamal and seeing, music like that. I also was a Phish head in high school, which is why, what led me to want to do something like Jazz is Phish, just because a huge influence on me. So like for me, like it was like I'd rather compose like, Do You Watch That Thing from Frank Zappa or like a Fluffhead from Phish, like some long form composition. That was like my bag, and wanting it to have like almost like a kind of grungy edge to it, like the 90s music I grew up with. That was kind of what I loved, and then it became a little, with like some R&B kind of D'Angelo vibes, like that I loved as well.
Yeah.
So those are my influences. I'm from a different generation, but with Danny growing up, in the generation he authentically grew up on that music. He loves it. But I had this like more humorous feeling about the music that he liked, where I was like, oh man, if we took ourselves like seriously as pop musicians doing this, but like made jokes about it, like I could totally get into that. That would be super fun. And it was a tough pill for him to swallow at first, because he genuinely was like, no, I'm serious about this. Just like, you could be serious about it, but we have the same sense of humor. Let's make some jokes. So like what was cool was it's the first band I've ever been in where before we ever before we launched the band, before we played a show, before we did anything, we had like conceptualized what the band would be, and we had ideas for songs, we had ideas for marketing, we had ideas for image, we had all this stuff kind of planned out before we ever did anything, which is a really unique experience for me, because most of the time it's just like, I like your music, let's write, we jam, we play a gig.
like as far as because it seems like there would have been opportunities for him to like hear what you had done to that point, like kind of get a sense of your style and taste.
Yeah, and interestingly, I'm working on a Chase Brothers record that's going to come out in the spring through Color Red, which is a record label that Eddie Roberts runs out of Colorado. And I had played him some of that music, and that's like Mac Ayers meets Roy Ayers. They have nothing to do with each other, but it's very like kind of gospel neo soul music that's kind of niche and heady, and it's so that album we're backed by a bunch of the Snarky guys, and Fred Wesley plays trombone on the record, and Jay White and Lyle Davinsky sing on the record, and as well as me and my brother and Cynthia McDermott and some other folks. It's just a really incredible record. Felix Pastorius plays bass, Justin Stanton from Snarky plays key bass, so there's like this layered thing, but there's like full compositional sections that are kind of Snarky influenced, and then there's all sorts of stuff that it's a very serious record, but it's definitely way different than what Danny likes. So he heard the music and knew that like my expressions were a bit different than his, but where like we met up in the middle was like just a really good place. So I think part of like what made it work was just that like the middle ground, I'd say, for our two tastes is something like a Wolfpack type of band, right? Where there's humor, there's some pop elements,
real chops.
Real chops, real musicianship, where that's like a easy bridge to like John Mayer type of music and things of that nature,
right?
And then John Mayer can get into take you into the pop world that that he likes, but it also can kind of bridges to the Grateful Dead, which bridges to Phish, which bridges to the world. So that was like kind of the middle ground for us, was something like that. So like the first song that we had wrote together was Stay Fresh, which is on our EP, which Corey Wong from Wolfpack, he mixed the record, and you can hear that kind of Wolfpack sound, and Felix Pastorius plays bass on it, and just like a really good song. And that was like, okay, this is like the middle ground of our worlds, and interestingly, there's a push-pull that continues to happen with us, where I think my taste wants us to be more organic. Like a lot of the stuff that I write for us ends up having that kind of like almost like an R&B feel, like more like I just want to like play real instrumentation, whereas his influence pushes us more to like Jack Antonoff, John Bellion style production, where it's it's more refined pop, where rather than live drums, where I'm using beat machines to create drums, and we're sampling them and then putting them through filters and adding a lot of elements that are even the way we recorded it, which the EP we just put out is intentionally like a live feel, like we did it live in the studio, a couple overdubs, but essentially live in the studio. Whereas the album, what will be our debut LP, is going to be produced like a pop record. So that way it's like shows both worlds that we're coming from. But there has been the push and pull there.
One of the things that I find interesting too is the kind of networking that you've done, right? Like over your career, it sounds like, and I'm finding it really interesting because when I've met so many drummers, and I have been the drummer that plays in isolation. And right now, from what I understand, there's more drummers now than there ever been, and there seems to be like a real, it's shot up in popularity. And I don't know if we have like Insta drumming to thank for that or whatever it is. But a lot of beat makers and a lot of people like coming into music production from that perspective, where that never happened before. It didn't happen very much. But I think a lot of folks still find themselves playing the instrument solo. And in so many ways, spiritually maybe, definitely historically, drums have been a community thing. And also, like I think what's really good advice that I've always gotten, and I find it to be true, is that you really, like, if you want to improve, you really got to play with other people live in the room. I think that there's nothing that can substitute that. How do you have anything to share as far as like how drummers or musicians in general can begin to network and kind of collect these folks like you have?
For me, it's well, it's organic for me, right? For two reasons. One is I've been at it for a very long time. You know, my high school band having a lot of success, you know, facilitated that. Where you know, I'm 19 years old, having dinner with David Crosby and Stephen Stills and Graham Nash, and you know, talking to them, befriending them, staying in touch with them. You know, it was harder back then in the 90s and early 2000s because, you know, YouTube. You know, when I started my career, YouTube didn't exist, Facebook didn't exist, Instagram didn't exist, TikTok didn't exist.
Right.
You know, if you wanted to stay in touch with someone, they had to be willing to give you like a phone number.
Right.
You know, email. Not even everyone had email addresses at that time. You know, when my first band, our ways of marketing was to get people's mailing addresses and send out mailers, and we would, as a band, sit with thousands of postcards, like, you know, printing out stamps and licking envelopes. And
there's like this business and networking and coordination like skill set that you had early. Where'd that come from, do you think?
Well, my father and my uncle are both lawyers and entrepreneurs, and they run their own, you know, law firm. And my father was a politician. He never actually got elected to anything, unfortunately, but he ran for office a few times. And you know, I actually I hated it growing up. Like, my dad would take me to different like political events and introduce me to everyone. Right. And to me, it was a burden. Like, I don't want to go, but like, I did. I love my dad. I would do anything for him, but it was a burden. But in retrospect, it was a gift because, you know, I watched him network. I watched him, introduce himself, introduce me to people. It made it so that I was comfortable around all sorts of different types of people that I wouldn't have necessarily been comfortable with had he not forced me into those situations. You know, because when he was running for office, we went to every community. He was taking me, you know, from political events with politicians and mayors and judges to like community events with you know different ethnic communities, and you know, everything from like, you know, chili cook-offs to fish fries and all these things where like I got to meet all sorts of different people. And my dad was, you know, involved in civil rights. He was at the Martin Luther King I Had a Dream speech and did work to get you know, when his political career didn't take off, he helped get like black politicians elected in black communities in Baltimore, where they, you know, it was usually someone from outside the community would come in. And so he was always very involved in a way that taught me the value of networking, the value of just getting out and meeting people,
just relationships.
Relationships, the value of relationships, and even like how he treats his friends. I learned a lot from my father. My mother was more the kind of person that like, I just want to stay home. Like she's good at keeping friends, but my father's networking and ability to just talk with people and stay in touch with people and be accountable to them and do things, you know, like just be a good person. You know, that played a big role. And then actually before I joined my brother's band, in between the college experiences from University of Colorado to University of Maryland, I dropped out of school for a year and I hitchhiked across the country on like a spiritual quest. And I studied on a Buddhist colony. I studied with the medicine man of the Lakota tribe. I did sweat lodge ceremonies. I studied with Krishnas. I ended up studying shamanism and actually drumming. Shamanistic drumming is a means of altering state of consciousness. So I've always been kind of a spiritually set person, and then went on the spiritual quest, which also opened my eyes to understanding different ways people, you know, seek their own spirituality from different cultures and how they find that spirituality. And so human connection, I was raised with it, and then I sought it. So early on, before there was like the easy way of just like, oh, let me follow you on Instagram or Facebook and we'll stay in touch. You know, I took the extra steps of just staying in touch with people. I'd write people letters, you know, if I met them, and, you know, letter writing was like a really cool thing. And that was instilled by my parents. Just if someone ever gave me a gift growing up, right? My parents were very dead set on like, you need to write a letter to thank them. Which is it's something that I think a lot of people overlook. You know, like how often do you get a letter now? Like, I mean, that happened back then, maybe more frequently, but even not even that much. But now it's like unheard of. Like you never get a handwritten letter for anything,
right?
But how much will that stand out to somebody? You know, like if you have an experience with someone and and it was a meaningful experience, sure, you could send them a quick Instagram message or something, say, hey, it was great to meet you,
Right.
you know. But if it was like a really touching experience and you take the time to like write a handwritten letter, like they're going to remember that. And it always stuck with me too, because I had an older sister. I was the youngest of three, and my older sister was 5 years older than me. You know, like she was dating different guys, and I was living with my parents while she was an adult because I was 5 years younger, and I would see how my parents would react to different boyfriends of hers.
Yeah.
And the boyfriends that they liked were the ones who would like write thank you letters to them or like take the extra step to like communicate. And, you know, does this play into how I market and how I do things? I don't know, but I think it's more of just the understanding of communication, the understanding of staying in touch with people, of, you know, going the extra mile to just make people feel appreciated. And then at the end of the day, like if it serves my music career, great.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, but I have friends and people think I'm a good person and I have a good quality of life because of that, then I'm fine with that too. Like everything doesn't have to have an ends. The means, you know, like the journey is the destination. It's just being a good person, you know. And it's funny because even in sales books, I've read some books on sales, and some of the books I've read, like when I'm done reading it, I was like, okay, so just be a good person.
Yeah, basically.
You know,
right?
like,
yeah.
you know, some people have to fake being a good person and convince someone they're a good person to gain trust to be able to sell something. But I think if you're just genuinely a good person and you communicate well, like that's, you know, that's the lesson there.
Yeah, a guy I had on recently said, like, you just got to show you can hang. That's more important than he's like the session drummer from Nashville. He's like, you just got to hang. You got to show you can hang more than your chops. There's his point was like, there's 1,000 great drummers in Nashville.
Yeah,
you're probably not getting the calls because you're the absolute best in town.
Yeah.
Like
100%.
If you've got the relationships, and then that also comes up too. Like there was another study that came out that showed that the folks that tend to be more financially successful, like when it comes down to so often like bartering for like an item, say these are the folks that you might sell something in Marketplace or Craigslist or whatever, they tend to lower their prices faster and spend more than the folks who get better deals. But in other ways, they often, like if you look outside of that, like their relationships, like they put a primacy on the relationship and not a deal on what they're selling or buying.
Yeah.
You know,
I'd say to riff off of that a little bit, and I think this is a good lesson for young musicians, but just people in general. One of the main things I learned when I was hitchhiking and on my spiritual journey is that your thoughts permeate you, right? So like, not just doing, you know, like doing the right thing or saying the right thing in any given situation. It starts with your thoughts, and you can control your thoughts. A lot of people allow their thoughts to control them, right? And just let that voice in their head talk to them.
Identify with those thoughts.
Right.
So much, yeah.
And it's very easy to do. It's human nature to let it happen. But what I learned, you know, from a spiritual perspective is that if you can change your thoughts, you can change your life, you know? So if you find yourself thinking negatively, even if it feels contrived at first, just force a positive mantra into your mind. Just tell yourself something positive about yourself, or tell yourself something good, and just kind of go to battle with the negative thoughts, right? Or self-serving thoughts, right? You know, so I found, you know, if you expect someone to do something for you, or if you do something with the expectation you're going to get something in return, there's like a level of ego in there that is in the thought. It starts in that thought, and your intent can be felt by others, right? And so, you know, when I was hitchhiking, you know, this was before, you know, smartphones, and I didn't have money at times. Like I had some very desperate experiences where it was like life or death, you know, homelessness type experiences. And when I expected something to happen for me, or I tried to like force something to happen for me, I noticed that people were turned off by it. You know, like if there was like something that was like, if I was operating out of fear, despair, control, and those were my thoughts that were driving my actions, that it would turn people away, and they didn't necessarily know why. You know, like right. I don't necessarily think everyone is that in tune to know why someone doesn't vibe you right, or, you know, they just know that, all right, I don't like this energy, or, you know, it's not speaking to me. But if you allow things to come to you and stay, you know, here and now and present, and you come from a pure place of thought, you know, where you're, you know, positive in thought. It's not a matter of controlling the situation, or you know, it's not acting out of like desperation or fear, but you're, you know, centered within yourself. Then you're going to put out a positive energy that people will be attracted to and drawn to. So even if you absolutely need something in your life, let alone want it for your career, if you need something in your life, I think, you know, from my vantage point and what I've learned in life, that it's good to not think about it in such a way where it becomes a despair, becomes a fear, right? Just, okay, I need this. I've acknowledged it. I'm going to let it go now. I'm going to put it out to the universe and let it go. Come back into myself and focus on what can I do to put out the best vibe that I can possibly put out. And a big part of putting out the best vibe you can put out is your thoughts. You can control your thoughts, and that people feel that energy. Like if you've ever been around someone who's super depressed, they don't need to say anything for you to know that there's something wrong. Especially a loved one. Oh my God, are you okay? They don't have to say anything, right? Or if someone is jubilant, like they don't have to say, I'm so happy. You can just, what are you in such a good mood about? You just sense it. You could see it. It changes your facial expressions. It changes the wrinkles on your forehead. It changes your cheeks. It changes your eyes. And you have the ability to take control of that in your brain. So how this all ties into music for me is going back to the hang conversation, right? 100%, there's 1,000 better drummers than me in this world. I'm more successful than a lot of them. And I credit a lot of that to the hangs. And in those hangs, you know, I'll go, you know, I put in, especially when I was younger, like a lot of sleepless nights to just hang with people until the sun came up, you know, and part of that was like my job description, like a hang is part of the job. Right. But when I was hanging with people, I didn't have this expectation that I'm going to put in this time with you and then you're going to do something for me. Right. I didn't have an expectation that, you know, you know, it's like, okay, I'm in the room. Like, let's just be authentic, be myself, be positive, be silly. If they vibe with me, great. If they don't, whatever. Like this is part of the life experience, you know. The journey is the destination, and carrying that kind of energy has allowed me to make a ton of friends, and some of those friends will never ask me to be in their bands. I think they're incredible musicians, and I'm probably just not good enough to play with them. They can get a better drummer, but they're my friends, and I'm totally content with that. Like I don't need them to hire me. I don't need them to consider me for their gigs, and a lot of them do hire me, and a lot of them do, you know, take, you know, more so than hire me, they take the call when I call them and say, hey, will you play this gig with me? They're like, fuck yeah, I love you, of course, let's go, you know. And with that, you know, life will also kind of show you the way, you know. Just because you love playing music doesn't mean that has to be your career. Just because you are good at an instrument doesn't mean you have to make a living from that instrument, right? But if you are coming from a place mentally where it has to be a certain way, or you know, like whatever, sometimes you can miss what life is trying to actually tell you, you know, and show you like that maybe there's another path that you're meant for in life. I think everyone should play music. Everyone should have an instrument of means of expressing themselves, but it's a really hard industry to make money in. Even the top, you know, some of the top guys that I know that are, you know, the most in-demand musicians, like they have side hustles. They teach at colleges. They make, you know, tenures. They have money coming in. You know, they sell books. They do master classes. Like it's not, you know, I think when
so many are doing lessons, like you said. I mean, just outside of just, you know, the academic setting, but they're online lessons. You
exactly.
from amazing musicians.
And it's not necessarily that they're even like, I set out to be a teacher. It's that it's really hard to make a living playing music, and you have to diversify. And so I think, like, you know, if you go out and, you know, play music because you love it to start, right? If you don't love it, then what are you doing? Right. You know, like it's not a competition, and it should. I mean, people do treat it like a competition in the world we live in, but I don't see it that way. I think that's a foolish way to look at music. Play it because you love it, practice it because you love it. If you love it, practice, even if practice is hard. That's that. I mean, not every time you sit down to practice, you're going to want to practice. But if you really want to master a craft, you have to push through the hard times to master any craft. Work on your vocabulary, but also, work on yourself as a human. Be a good person, figure out how to grow spiritually, and it'll open doors. And people will come into your life. And then if you stay in a place where, you put your intent out to the world, but then you come back to yourself and you focus on how to be the best version of yourself that you can be, then the world is gonna things will come back to you. The energy you put out will come back, and it might show you a different path. It might, I built my home on photography work. I didn't know growing up I was going to be a photographer. It was just, I started making silly videos at one point. And then a friend of mine was getting married, and she was like, "Hey, will you make a video like that for my wedding?" I was like, "Yeah, no problem." And I did it just for fun. And then the caterer saw that and was like, "Hey, will you do a video?" And next thing you know, I'm doing wedding photography and videography around my touring schedules, and that paid my bills. That bought my house.
Okay.
I didn't expect to do it, and if I wasn't just in the moment, and if I would have, my ego would have gotten in the way of, I have to be a full-time musician and I can't do anything but this, I would have turned down the opportunity to be in Asheville, because if I didn't own a home, I probably couldn't afford to be here.
How did you land in Asheville?
So I lived in, I chased a girl from Baltimore to Charleston when I was touring with that high school band. I played a show in Charleston, met a girl, fell in love, moved to Charleston. And then when that relationship ended and I met, who's now my wife, would come up and vacation in Nashville. And then
was she already working in the industry as a manager?
Well, when I met her, she was 19, 20 years old, and she actually worked for one of my bands as her first job. She did tour management. And so I kind of brought her into the music industry to work for me, and we weren't together at that point. And actually through working together is when I was just like, you're a badass. And so the respect came from working together. But yeah, she wanted to get out of Charleston, which I was cool with. We actually talked about going to LA, but before driving across the country, we stopped in Asheville for a weekend, and we ended up finding a house to rent, and we loved it. And we're like, let's just stay here for a little bit, save up money. Okay. It's cheaper than California. Right. And then, 14 years later, we're still here.
Right. And now, the expense is more similar than it ever has been.
Yeah, maybe not quite to California, but it's getting there.
Seems like it's climbing.
Yeah.
And then you started some projects. So I talked to a mutual friend, Ram Mandelkorn.
Yeah.
He's like, ask him about Black Eyed Susan.
Yeah, so that's that high school band that played with Santana and Crosby, Stills and Nash and Aerosmith and all those groups.
Dude, I remember that band, Black Eyed Susan. Now that I'm putting it together now. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So tomorrow, which by the time people hear this podcast will probably be in the past, but from the day that we're recording this, what will be tomorrow, we're actually going to do at least one Black Eyed Susan song that I pulled out of the archives for the show. But yeah, that band, that was super fun. That was our high school band that evolved into a college band. We ran it to the ground, and the issue with that band is we would build it around a vocalist, and then something would happen to vocalists. The first iteration of it was just all the musicians singing, and then we got this female vocalist who we opened up for a nationally touring act when we were still just a Baltimore-based band, and weren't really touring at all. And she was amazing, and we opened for this national act, and their singer was leaving, and they knew it. And then they saw our singer, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're perfect for our band." And we couldn't compete with what they could offer. They're like, "We'll take you on national tours, and give you a salary." And we couldn't do anything but give our blessing. It would have been selfish to say no, don't take. Even though we had just built the whole band around her, we were like, "Yeah, go do it." If that's what you want, we can't deny that we can't provide that opportunity at this point in our careers. So she left, and then we built the band up again, but around a bass player who was singing for us, and he had a great lead tone and lead voice and presence and was really great. And then he got poached for another band to be the bass player who, he believed in was going to be a good opportunity. He was always, while he had all the talent to be a front man, and had the voice for it, he didn't believe in himself the way we believed in him. He didn't necessarily want to be a front man.
Okay.
I think he would have done great with it, and he did do great while he did it. But another opportunity which came about, which ended up being a band called The Bridge, which is Chris Jacobs' band, who is a well-known touring musician now. He ended up touring with Chris, which ended up being a great opportunity for him, right? It was like,
it sounds like too, like you're collecting all these relationships and maintaining them throughout all this, right? Like not holding on too tightly, like seeing folks kind of have opportunities and putting them in a position to take those opportunities with no guilt and no pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. It was tough. It was a tough pill to swallow because we would put a lot of money and time into building the bands around these different people, and then they would go. And then the next step we ended up, I brought the band down to Charleston, and we built the band up as a trio with my brother, and Aaron was the keyboardist, and Aaron was like singing, playing key bass and keys at the same time. He was totally split up and really good at all three. Wow. And that band started to grow in Charleston, and we got a really good following there. And then we brought in a female vocalist that was like had the front person energy, Elise Testone, and then she went on American Idol and got in like the top 5 or top 6, and she ended up moving to New York and pursuing her career on the end of her time on American Idol because she did so well with it. And again, with go do it. It's a great, great opportunity. And before that, there was like that band was, the wheels were coming off of it a little bit anyways. Like we were getting older, we still weren't really making money, even though the experiences were great. We were opening for huge bands, we had great turnouts. Like we were we would have a good year and then put all the money we made into a record, before you could do home recordings, so drop 20 grand on a record, and that was all the money you made for the year. Money came and went. So again, it's a really hard industry. Even when you're getting the breaks to play with the Santanas and Aerosmiths of the world, it's still a really tough industry to make a living in. That was that band, Black Eyed Susan. We ended up changing the name to Emotive, right before the wheels fell off. It was like when we brought in Elise, we wanted to kind of change the image of the band a little bit, and so we changed the band name. And then like right around that time, Aaron, who was our main songwriter, he ended up having a child with his love, and then when you have a kid, when you're not making money, the pressure mounts. So he went and pursued. He was actually a savant. On top of playing multiple instruments at the same time and singing, he also was a savant architect, where he never actually pursued it as a living. But when he was in high school, his high school asked him to design a new building because that's how good he was at architecture. So he ended up moving to Austin, Texas, and building like an empire for himself. Like he has like this huge like development firm, and he's an architect now. Still plays music for himself anyways. And so sometimes the genius can take you into different directions, but again, for him, like go do it. Do what you got to do. But so that band was a great ride. Lots of different iterations of what that band was. It was a really cool experience growing up because my brother and I, even before I joined the band, I was involved with it. I played percussion, and I would actually, when I was in high school, before I was officially in the band, I was kind of the pseudo manager. I would, handle the marketing and the money and the negotiations and all the different things. So I've always kind of had my foot in that world as well, as far as like a business perspective.
Do you ever find yourself in the position where you're the musical director and someone else is the band leader?
Not so much anymore. Not so much anymore. So Tom Marshall, who's the lyricist for Phish, had this thing called Jam Just Happened, that he was trying to start like a improvisational series with Scott Metzger, who's in J-Rad, Joe Russo's Almost Dead. I actually got the call for that to be like a musical director, which it was all improvisation, so it was a lot different than kind of taking control of like arrangements and things of that nature and practices. There's no practicing, there was no arrangements, but it was more of just he tapped me to like bring people together to get different musicians and put collaborations together for it, and then to kind of get everyone aligned before we went on stage and just discuss my spiritual approach to music and kind of get everyone into a headspace to go be 4 or 5, 6 strangers to improvise for 2 hours. So that was the closest thing where it was like not my project. And then it ended up, I had something similar called the Dab Sessions, which I had done a couple of different performances. Actually, the first Dab Sessions I did was in LA. It was like a NAMM after party.
Okay.
And the band, the official band, was myself with Cody Wright on bass, who used to live in Asheville, amazing bass player, and then Jay Jennings, the trumpet player from Snarky Puppy, and Sly Fifth Ave, he toured with Ghost Note for a long time, saxophone player. He, in his own right, is a brilliant composer, arranger, conductor, really incredible performer, musician. So it was the 4 of us, and then that night was all these musicians from NAMM came, like Sput from Ghost Note and Snarky. He brought a bunch of different musicians out, and just people from all over came out. And so that night was, from what I understand, the first time that JD Beck and Domi ever played together. That's when I met them. Oh. They came to the show, and I was, Domi was on stage playing, and then
they
JD,
were like they were both about the same age.
At that show, I think JD was like 13, 14 years old, and Domi was like 16, 17, something like that. But I remember I played a couple of tunes with Domi, and then JD walked up. He's like, "Hey, can I play with Domi?" I was like, yeah, come on up stage. And then the rest is history there. But that was like lightning in a bottle. So like that show, Pete Knudsen came out, and Charlie Brown, and that's when I met them, and they played. And then Pete, I believe that might have been the first time he played with Sput, and then that got him the gig with Ghost Note. And then Pete and Charlie ended up playing with Mono Neon. So many amazing musicians were there that night. It was the first time I played with a bass player named John Daniel Ray, who is like one of my go-to bass players in North Carolina. He's a phenomenal bassist out of Winston-Salem, and I met him that day and played with him that night. Cesare Schneck, I think. I hope that's how I pronounce his last name. I just
caught him for the first time on Sunday.
At Little Jumbo?
Yes.
Yeah, he's incredible.
It happened that night. I felt it anyway, out in the crowd. And it was cool, too, because I looked around. There was just tons of musicians there to see. I mean, just that lineup was just so cool.
Yeah. So Chaz, I had met Chaz through, he did some gigs with Jonathan Scales, and so I had met him previously, but he came out, sat in and played, and it was just, just looking back. And
did you play with John?
No, I've never played. I mean, John is on the Jazz is Phish record, and he toured with me.
Okay.
With Jazz is Phish, but I didn't play in the orchestra.
Gotcha.
And that's a scenario where like I have, like, he's one of my best friends, but for what he's looking for his drummers, I don't take any offense at all that I don't get the call. Like someone like Mason Guidry is got, a level of chops that, I mean, I'd say Mason's one of the best drummers in the world. Like, I would never say that about myself.
Right.
But I'll say that with absolute certainty about Mason. And for a percussive trio, where the drummer is essentially the star of the show, like, go get yourself a Mason. That's fine. Like, the drummers he's had, like, I mean, if you ever called me, I would put in the time and study like a maniac to be able to play his stuff appropriately, but that's a good example of where I have a great relationship. Never had any expectations of what it would lead to. He ended up touring with me, being on my record, and I don't get offended at all that I don't get the call for his band. It's totally fine.
Being amongst all those folks and like finding situations where you can just like promote the music. You know, it seems like that's like been one of your overarching themes throughout your life, is just not necessarily always being the center of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more so as I age, I'm centering myself a little bit more than I used to. Like even in band pictures, when I would put these great bands together, I would intentionally just go stand at the back, everybody come together. Like, it's I don't need to be front and center, we're all the stuff. And now it's like, you know what? I've been doing this for a long time. It's really hard work. getting, especially on the other end of the pandemic, like before the pandemic, it was just all I knew, all I did. And then I took some time off, and now trying to get it back, I'm like, how the hell did I do this? I was putting together 10, 13, 16 piece bands, where everybody lived in a different state, coming together, finding a way to get like a quick rehearsal in, and then performing at an extremely high level with complex charts, like doing, really intense arranging, just traveling with large groups, the logistics that went into it, and now on this end of it, realizing, like, I'm going to stand in the center of this little group shot here. Let's I could center myself a little bit. Nice. This is really hard work.
Yeah.
I'll take my flowers now.
Yeah. I was just having this conversation with another local drummer here, and we were talking a little bit about the ego and the id, and like, so much talk these days about like shrinking the ego, and really music can be one of those things. It can allow you to separate a little bit from the ego and kind of find yourself. And also there's a certain aspect of the ego that's important, and it's just a matter of maybe integrating it enough to where it's not driving everything, but at the same time, like, some self-promotion is important.
Yeah.
Like like you said, you've putting in the work. Whether or not they would have happened, they wouldn't have happened in exactly the way that they did without your input and your efforts.
Yeah, 100%. And, I have grown a lot as a musician too, over the years. So I do feel like I have a unique voice on my instrument now that, when I first started some of these collaborative projects, like when Black Eyed Susan ended, when Emotive and all that stuff kind of came to an end, I found myself as a drummer without a band, which it's difficult to be in that situation. The guitar player can go play solo shows, the piano player can go play solo shows. As a drummer, you need a band,
right?
And that's when I started doing the tributes, because it was like, all right, well, while I figure out how to get my next band launched, I can do tributes where no one can quit the band because no one's in the band, right? No one can get poached from the band because no one's in the band.
Yeah.
And if one person's not available, I can get the next person that I like, and then I still have a show to play.
Yeah.
And that I launched Jazz's Phish, the James Brown Dance Party, and a couple other projects.
Was that when you got to work with Stubblefield?
Yeah. So the James Brown Dance Party, it was something that I had dabbled with through that band, Black Eyed Susan, or Emotive at the time, with Elise, and we did a couple shows and a couple James Brown tributes in Charleston, and they went over well, and then the band broke up, and that kind of all came to an end. But I really loved it. I loved that project. I loved the name. I thought it was a fun name, and wanted to like keep doing something with it. So like years later, it was like, I'm gonna say like 4 years or 5 years of not doing it. I put it back together, and I flew Jeff Sipe up to New York, and he and I did double drums, and we
that's sweet.
We brought a bunch of killer musicians together, Jen Hartswick from Train Anastasio Band, and some other, my brother and I, Todd Stoops, and some different musicians together, and we did a show in New York, and it went really well. And I had learned from growing up in Baltimore that there was like some Baltimore DC based cats that had toured with James Brown. So when that went well and I wanted to do it again, I was like, man, I should like start reaching out to some different people from James's band, from James Brown's band, and see if they would want to be a part of it. Like, that would be authentic and fun, and kind of like make it less of a tribute and more of authentic, because it's with those cats. So Mousy Thompson was a drummer that lived in DC. I reached out to Mousy, like, hey, would you want to do this?
What's Mousy up to these days?
He has his own James Brown tribute with like kind of a bit of an impersonator for James Brown. The guy wears a wig and does the whole shtick, but it's fun. He gets a lot of gigs in like the Baltimore DC area. And
I just chatted with Eric Hargrove.
Oh, nice. Yeah, Eric's done a James Brown Dance Party,
and he was with. Oh, did he?
Yeah.
With y'all? Nice. But did you ever play with Keith Jenkins?
Yep. I play with Keith. I play with Amy, Christian, Leroy Harper Jr., Jeff Watkins. In New Orleans, he was the music director that ended James's career. A bunch of other cats have been involved. So I think at this point, like 20 different people who've played with James Brown
That's cool.
and toured his band and been part of James Brown Dance Party. The highlights for me, and not diminishing any of everybody's been amazing. I've learned so much from everyone, but Fred Wesley and Clyde Stubblefield are obviously two of the bigger names, outside of Maceo and Bootsy. I'd say Fred and Clyde are, Fred is the only one who got, Maceo did get credits, and a lot of Maceo's music came out just as Maceo Parker, whereas, Fred Wesley's tunes ended up on James Brown records, like Doing It to Death. It was like Fred Wesley and the New JBs and the JBs, and then, it's James singing, but it's, the song's attributed to Fred. So Fred's impact is obviously, pretty astute. And then Clyde and Jabo invented funk drumming. And Clyde is the most sampled drummer of all time, the funky drummer, Cold Sweat, some of the beats that he wrote using ghost notes and that kind of approach that just wasn't done before him. And he's not a technical cat. Like, he just played what felt good to him. But yeah, that was a really interesting thing. Because like when I played with Mousy for the first time, I realized I was doing a lot wrong. Like, I was like trying too hard to be an impressive drummer, so I was like flipping beats and hitting on weird parts of the beat, or like trying to do like
fusion thing, right?
I was like doing fusion syncopations, and he's like, nah, like this is how you do it. And then I did a bunch of shows with Clyde, and I'm like watching him play. We would do 2 drum sets side by side, and so just like front row seats, I'm like looking over his shoulder, but in real time being able to mimic what I'm seeing essentially, and internalize the feel, internalize the timing. And it changed my drumming, and the deeper I got into the James Brown catalog and into working with his musicians, the less I played, the more, and often when I would get the biggest compliments, when like Fred Thomas, the bass player for James Brown, played with him for 30 years, when he would come up to me after show, you kicked ass. Those were the shows where like I didn't do any drum fills. It was like all pocket drumming. I didn't, just hits on the ones, like just like really straightforward music.
It's, right now, that's one of the things that I'm like struggling with a little bit. It's like solos, right?
Yeah.
And like I'll go to the open funk jams, and I feel like I'm in the pocket. It's going pretty well. And then they're like, well, let's give the drummer some. And I was just like, oh, shit. And it just like kind of falls apart, Yeah. And then I've got a kind of a mentor, and he is like, well, the solo is your opportunity to kind of like show a little bit of who you are, And I was like, that seems like a lot of pressure. And then I see things like, or I hear things like, I've been diving a little bit more into Lenny White, and he was like on this clinic that he did in the early 80s. He said something like he doesn't like solos. He feels like he talks first about being a bottom up drummer, so like it's all low end for him. It kind of starts from there, but at the same time he says those things. But I listened to some of my favorite recordings, like Red Clay. He's just got a killer open musical melodic drum solo right in the middle of it,
Yeah.
And then I've heard the same thing with like Adam Deitch, and he's another just monster at the drums. And then like on his new track, like he's got pretty substantial like soloing going on, So it's like I'm hearing both things. Like, yeah, I hate it, and also it seems like it's kind of necessary, but maybe not.
I'm in the same boat. I hate drum solos. I hate getting drum solo. And it all depends on the drummer. Like, again, like Mason Guidry takes a drum solo, I'm going to watch it, and I'm not going to get bored. I'm going to be, jaw dropped. But for the most part, even great drum solos, like if I'm listening to like a jazz record and it gets to the drum solo and everyone drops out and it's just the drummer, like a few bars in, I'm most likely going to just skip to the next song, And that's tough, because if you want to get, like, I wanted to study with Quentin Baxter. Quentin Baxter is a drummer in Charleston, South Carolina, who teaches at College of Charleston. Amazing drummer, phenomenal. And I remember when I called him to study, I was like, hey, I just want to get good at jazz. He's like, do you listen to jazz? It's like, not really. He's like, start there. Like, listen to it. And you'll understand the vocabulary, but like I'm like there's no point in like taking lessons on how to play it if you don't listen to it.
Right.
And that stuck with me, and I think if one of the things is like, if you want to get good at drum solos, you got to listen to a lot of drum solos,
Right.
and like understand how they develop and what the vocabulary is, and then take the time to learn the vocabulary. And, you know, someone who I'm cool with just, you know, snapping on 2 and 4 and hearing piano.
Right.
Like, I don't, you know, like it's never been a huge appeal to me. And I find I do like soloing, but my favorite solos I've ever taken are when the band keeps playing and they're comping, and I'm able to be melodic and treat it like a melodic instrument, and kind of sing and dance around the groove or the soundscape that's being laid out for me. When it's the kind of drum solo where everyone just stops and like, okay, drums, and everyone just like kind of takes it as an opportunity to drink their water and sit down, like, I get annoyed sometimes, like, man, I comp for you.
Right.
Like, jump on back in here, you know. Like, and I think bass players get annoyed with that sometimes when everyone drops out. Like, give me some color, give me something,
Right.
you know. And you know, there are drum solos that, like, again, like Tony Royster Jr. Like, there's this video that you can look up on YouTube. I think it was 12 years old. It's incredible. It's musical. It's choppy. It's, you know, and it's just drums, and it's not lacking. It's fine, you know. And that's a certain style of drumming. That's a certain type of drummer. But I think, you know, melodic-minded people, especially like percussionists who play melodic instruments too, like myself, who start on piano. But yeah, I feel like, you know, people who like to play other instruments or, you know, more melodic-minded, it's nice. I don't mind soloing if I have like a soundscape. I have to battle my ego during, like, more so. Like, if the band's playing, like, the song tells me what needs to happen and I can solo around things. When everyone drops out, like, there's this pressure to like get a rise out of the crowd, and there's like a pressure that happens when the band stops, where it's really easy to get into your brain of like, oh, what am I doing, and how is it being, you know, viewed, and is it cool, does it make me look good, is it impressive? And then once you start thinking, then you're not really like serving the music. So, you know, I try really hard when I get a solo to like not give a fuck what anyone thinks, even though there is that pressure. It's really hard, but I try. It's tough for me because, like, when the band stops, my brain keeps playing the song. So like, I'm playing along to the song, and if the other guys in the band stop counting or stop hearing the song in their head, then it's like, I'm ready to come back in and they're not there. I'm like, oh, come on. It depends on the players too, you know. You know, a band like Jazz's Phish, where I'm the music director, you know, if I get hired to play with some cats locally and it's not my gig, you know, and I'm just playing like a jazz gig, and they're like, okay, drums, and they, you know, like, it's not my gig. I'll do the solo, and whenever they come back in is when they're going to come back in. But like, if it's my gig, I'll like verbally say like, hey, keep that going, or come in on the one, here we go, you know, like whatever. I'm very dictative of like what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, or hey, give me stabs on the ones, or just something like, you know, like, I'm very, you know, I'll take control of the band from like a musical direction standpoint of like, this is what I want to happen now. But if it's someone else's gig, it's kind of harder to, you know, think that way or take control that way.
It sounds like you put a lot of acts together, right? And so you find yourself in that leadership role, and that's where you kind of get tapped for, or you take on that role of music director. Interested in that transition, but then at the same time, it's so obvious too, right? Like, if you're playing drums and you're the cue for so many people, and you're kind of holding true north, so to speak, or at least where the one is, right? Like, you're kind of helping kind of guide folks in that direction. So in a lot of ways, it seems pretty natural. Do you feel it's natural for you?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, I leaned on my brother the majority of my career, you know, because he was the guy I looked up to musically when I was young.
Right.
So up until he had kids, even with Jazz's Phish, early iterations of Jazz's Phish, while it was my idea for the band, and I pushed a lot of the early arrangements, you know, like, hey, this is what I'm hearing, and we would sit down and work it out. I leaned on my brother a lot, like, hey, on stage, you're going to cue everyone, you're going to, you know, call changes, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. You got to step up for me, because I don't have that skill. I didn't feel like I had that skill. And then when he had his kids and he started not being able to do gigs, it forced me to step up and be
Yeah.
like, I need to understand music a little bit better. So like, what is it that I need here? Oh, I need everyone to go to the 4. I need everyone to go to the 5 or back to the 1, or, do, modulate or whatever. And I needed to understand what all those things meant, how to call them, when's the right time to call them, like what is the appropriate lead in time to say now or on the 1, and, it not be like, oh shit, it's like right here, so, my understanding of music, my understanding of communication, even like talking to the audience, commanding the band, like I grew exponentially when I had to. It was like thrown into the fire. My brother's like, I can't do the tour. I've got, a 2-month-old and it's just too much right now. So yeah, I found myself in a position where I had to be that guy, and I stepped up to the plate, and it was natural. It was, and I think some of it, like, when you talk about like promotions and networking and all these things, like, I don't want to like give someone like a false sense of reality. Like I've always been that guy. Like I've always been good at those things. I cultivated those strengths for this world that I'm in. But yeah, I mean, when I like earlier in our discussion, like these were things I was doing when I was a kid. These were things I was exposed to in my youth. From a management standpoint and marketing standpoint, I was doing that for my brother when I was 15, like I've always been business minded, marketing minded, good communicator, good networker. Like those are always strengths of mine anyways. So like, it all leans itself into that. And I think a lot of musicians appreciate that too, because, again, I play with musicians. I try to play with musicians that are better than me because it makes me better. And I think a lot of those musicians, if they did the same gig with the same band under the same name, they might not be able to sell any tickets. They might not be able to get the right people together on stage. They would have a hard time with the logistics, with the process. So when I hire them, it's like, oh, I'm going to play with awesome people. I'm not to worry about all this. It's going to get taken care of. These things, so like, I think if you're not naturally good at it, sure, like you have to be, as an artist of any sort, you have to find a way to learn about business.
Sure.
Because that's an essential part. But like, if you can find someone in your life, whether they're in your group or adjacent to your group or a manager or a friend, find someone who's just naturally good at business, naturally good at marketing, naturally good at communication, logistics, networking, and have them in your life and value them. I feel like a lot of musicians make the mistake of only valuing other musicians, like, and not just other musicians, like you have to be impressive for them to give a fuck about you.
Right.
I think that's such a toxic and terrible way to look at the world, because a Jerry Garcia quote that always stuck with me, and I'm not going to actually quote it because I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of like, someone was saying something about his guitar playing and how it made him special, and he was like, I'm no different than like a cobbler, like someone's really good at making shoes, or it's just a craft, it's like, and people have different skills, and that always stuck with me as something where like, you do have to value people of all sorts of backgrounds, of all sorts, just because someone's not good at music doesn't mean they're not a valuable person. Right. Just because someone doesn't play music at all doesn't mean they can't be, an important part of your life. Or especially in like the jazz world and the chops world, the Insta musician, the Berkeley schools of music type places, like people judge each other so harshly based on how good they are at their instrument.
Right.
And that's like that. There's dead ends to that mentality. You end up alone, or just being an asshole. And like, what kind of life are you gonna live? But like, if you just value people for being good people, and you focus again on the hang, the vibe, the energy. Like,
but I think it's also valuable. What you're saying too is like, I think so many folks get into it, and maybe they have this specific idea in mind about what they want to communicate with their music. And then they take on like all the responsibilities and roles, and they feel like they can't let go of that. And they it's logistics. Who's good at logistics? Like I think we become pretty quick to throw out the window the things that we feel like we're not good at, and we feel like, well, who's going to be good at this? And then we just say, well, it's just hard and this sucks and I hate this aspect of it. But in actuality, there are people who are really good at logistics that just have their mind works that way, or they're really good at the paperwork. the mind-numbing paperwork that people wouldn't even think about. Like there are people who are actually like get their systems down and they love those systems. And so I think whether or not you are the person that's like promoting the gig and putting the people together, like you're saying, you don't have to be that person, but you do need to find some support in some way for folks that are like that.
A lesson that I learned from the late James Casey, who passed away from colon cancer. He was a really harsh critic of mine musically. Like he would give me shit about, hey, your tempo is fluctuating during this bar of this song. Like it was so specific. And I was like, man, people usually don't get hung up on that shit, But as someone who listened to hip hop, who did a lot of production where everything is metered, metronomed, and he had a really high expectation of what he wanted for himself and what he wanted, and I wanted to hang, So like when I would get feedback like that, I was so happy for it. He was harsh, but it like made me such a better musician. But he made a comment to me once just about, I like made an excuse for why I wasn't better at the time, as a musician, as a drummer. I was like, man, I'm booking it, I'm putting all these people together, I'm promoting, I'm doing all this work, like it's nice if all I had to do was 12 hours of practice, but I don't have that. Like I'm like, I'm happy with where I'm at, I'm going to keep getting better. And he was like, man, if you work on your music and you work on your craft, like if you get to a point where you're undeniable, then you're going to get the support. Like people are going to be attracted to it, to where they want to help you with those things. But if you're not performing up to par, where people like me are like, hey, I'm not going to be interested in playing with you in the future if you're not going to improve, then it's going to be, you're going to carry a heavy load, and it's going to end up being all in vain, because you're going to end up with nobody when it's all said and done. Because if you're not good enough, like, there's a million people playing music. If you're not practicing, someone else is.
Right.
And, someone else is going to get the gig. Someone else is going to, put out better music. And it's a uber competitive business, which it is, even though it's not a competition, it's still a competitive business, right? Music is in the eye of the beholder, whether you like it or not, but there's so much music, and like, what are you doing that's going to capture someone's ears, and is it needed, right? Some music, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, just because you play music doesn't mean it has to be a living, right? So yeah, if I'm, good at business, but I'm not actually practicing, and I'm not getting better at my music, I'm not putting out compelling music, maybe I should just be a music manager, which is a thought I had at that point, but no, I love it. And I needed honesty for, part of being the leader, the band leader, and the person employing people is a lot of people aren't honest with you. I've been in situations where,
especially you add the power differential.
Yeah.
There's some veil that comes up.
Yeah, I'm a source of income for a lot of people. I used to 1099 like 250 musicians a year. And before the pandemic, it hasn't, it's gotten close to that. And now I have a duo as my main project, for good reason. It's definitely, I had that experience actually. I had a band on tour. We finished early, and all the players went to this open jam session. And there was this famous sax player, I'm not going to say his name. He apparently was vibing all of my players, who were great players, but like having like a competitive kind of vibe towards them and being like disrespectful to them, and then I show up late because I was setting up, getting everyone into the hotel and kind of checking in and doing all the, like, let everyone go out, I'll handle the business, you guys go have fun, I'll meet you there. So I get there, and the same guy who was treating them all like shit came up to me, and I'd hired him for a bunch of gigs, and I continued to, he's on my radar as someone I want to employ, and he was so nice to me. And when we left, I was like, man, I love that guy. And then all the guys were like, yo, what's up with your friend? And told me what he did and shit he said to them. And I was like, that guy, like, I never would have seen it. And that happens with, like, not just, like a employer-employee kind of relationships, but like male and female. Like my wife, who works in the music industry, she's had experiences with male musicians where they treat me one way, treat her completely differently, where when she tells me about it, I'm like, really? The guy's so nice to me. But, like, if you're tall, if you're short, if you're male, if you're female, if you're the employer versus the employee, like, all these things will affect how people treat you.
Yeah.
So you don't always see the truth of a situation or of a person. But that's a whole nother. I think we just opened up a whole other conversation. That's for the next podcast.
The next one, for sure. Yeah.
I guess I'll end on the sentiment of don't resent the people who give you the tough criticism. It hurts when you hear things that, hey, you're not as good as you should be, or you need to work on XYZ, or, you suck even, like, thank people who give you the tough criticism. Don't shut off, don't take it, take it personally to go get better. If you don't want that feedback, right? You want to be good at what you do, and if you're not good at what you do, you want to find something else. But the people who have been the toughest on me, I am the most grateful for. The people where their initial criticism made me, if I was a weaker man, I would have cried, like it was like harsh criticism. And not to say, hey, if you shed tears doesn't mean you're weak. Like, I don't mean it in that respect.
But if it stops you in your tracks, right? Like, you can't get past it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that point of trauma that you can't get over.
Yeah.
It's like,
and that's in business, that's in music, that's in life. Like, the people who tell you you're great can make you complicit. The people who say you're awesome, you're perfect, you're wonderful. Oh, I feel great about myself. What are you doing to change? Nothing. You're perfect, right? But it's the people who are like, hey man, you got to work on this, bro. Like, you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Even if it just like cuts you so deep that it leaves a scar, like, you're gonna come back stronger from that than any compliment you'll ever get.
Totally. Carol Dweck was this researcher, and he talked about mindset and his growth mindset specifically versus fixed mindset, and the compliments that have been shown in her studies that they can actually undercut your future performance. And not only that, but the studies that they did for these young kids, they're all taking tests, and they were even given some praise just beforehand, or they were given like a compliment, like you're talking about, somewhere about like kind of the status of who they are. Oh, you're a very smart kid, right? Versus like, the growth mindset would be like, you're persistent. You consistently coming at it. Like you come up with novel ways to approach these problems, right? And the people that were told that they were smart were not only more likely to not do as well in the future, but they were also more likely to lie and cheat about their performance, because it became a part of their identity. And so then the ego came in and said, we have to protect this at all costs. And they were less likely to take on challenging questions too. Whereas like the people were like, you don't quit. Like I can tell you like a challenge. Those are the folks that like, they make a mistake or they don't do as well. They're on to the next one. How do I improve upon this? And so the compliments don't help. I mean, I think there's a way to compliment.
There's a way to compliment. And then personally, it goes back to also the mindset. You don't want criticism to put you into a negative place where you start to beat yourself up in a negative way. You want to use criticism to build upon yourself. You want to find your weaknesses and make them strengths. And you still, again, you want to have a good vibe. You don't want to be so down on yourself that no one wants to be around you, and you really don't want to be down on yourself. So like self-criticism and accepting criticism is not the same as self-doubt or self-hatred or anything. Like they're not the same things, right? So it's important to draw those lines too for yourself. It's good to like have some compliments in life. It's good to feel good about yourself. It's good to feel positive about what you're doing. But within that, it's also good to think to yourself, how can I improve at this? How can I get better? Just to be your best self, right? The best version of yourself. And there's always room for growth with everything we do,
Awesome, Adam. Well, thanks so much for showing up, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Sorry for being so long-winded.
I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, I invite you to leave a 5-star review. Also, you can find me on Instagram and YouTube, and feel free to follow, like, subscribe, and comment. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you for the next one.